Hello, welcome to Liberate from Hate. I'm Dawn Ely, and this is a presentation on mastering the ego's shadow and taking back your power. So, welcome, and thank you for taking the initiative to join us for this very important topic and one that so many people have really struggled with because life, a lot of times, is being thought of as a struggle. So congratulations for taking the initiative to come and listen to what we've got to say, and hopefully we can help you and look at all of the great things that are in life and how you can participate in them instead of anything that's negative like sadness or depression or anger or angst or irritation at others, all of that. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the ego shadow and taking back your power. So who am I and what is Liberate from Hate? So my name is Dawn Ely, and I have been a 25-year business executive and founder of domestic and international companies, primarily helping the small mid-sized business, both here in the U.S. and internationally in many countries. And couple of years ago, I decided that I was going to take a different tact, and I went. And now I'm doing the nonprofit thing. And so my background is from, in addition to the executive side, I'm a trained and certified Stephen minister. And you say, well, what is a Stephen minister? Well, it is actually somebody that is in the layperson's category. So I'm not an officially indoctrinated clergy, and I'm not a certified counselor in terms of a psychologist, psychiatrist, but a certified Stephen minister is somebody that has been trained by those psychologists and psychiatrists and trained in ministry by clergy. I happen to have an interfaith background, but a Stephen minister is primarily in the Christian tradition. But I also have studied in the Kabbalah, trained and studied shaman, and I also study Sufism with a heart-focused healing order in the area. And I am also trained in hotline operating. So not like the 911, but like suicide assistance and those kind of emergent need type of hotlines where somebody's super depressed or something worse, where they would call and just talk to somebody. And I'm also Harvard educated with world religions. I'm in the process of a graduate degree. I'm also JD, so I have my law degree, and I graduated from the University of Virginia. So I've had a lot of stuff going on in the last 20 years. And so from all of these different environments, I also teach courses on how to communicate with international cultures, with the role of culture in international communications. So that's who I am. And I created a company called Liberate from Hate, which is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. And our mission is to enable and inspire the movement away from all forms of hate and divisiveness through empowerment, education, and sharing constructive coping skills. We have several projects ongoing. One is this course, Mastering the Ego's Shadow and Taking Back Your Power. We do it online. We also do it in person. We have groups called the Faith Club groups, which are embedded community groups that get together and talk about the different diversities that they represent, whether that's religious or otherwise. The Faith Clubs is primarily about different religious groups and religious identities that people can get together and kind of explore their thoughts about one another and get to really humanize the people of these different identities. We also have a university scholarship program for at-risk youth in underprivileged and conflict-ridden areas. And we have the Global Success Centers, which actually facilitates local economic and entrepreneurial growth in underprivileged and conflict-ridden areas to hopefully give them an economically sustainable environment to continue the ridding of conflict and hostilities. So that's who we are. And that's what we want to do. And today we're going to cover what is the nature of our suffering in life, and the fact that it is actually caused by our ego shadow. And so what is that? And what's the nature of our suffering? And then how does the ego create the shadow? How is the shadow created? What is the nature of our ego versus who we truly are? Are we our ego or are we something different? And how does that interplay? And how does our ego shadow show up in our lives? How do we know that when we're acting or behaving or thinking, we're actually in our shadow or we're in our ego? And how do we know what the difference is? What's the alternative? And then, of course, how to be the master of your domain. We all want to be the master of our domain. We've all seen that old Seinfeld thing. This is a little bit different, but it's still being the master of your domain. You choose how you're going to think, how you're going to emote, how you're going to behave, and from where you are operating. Your ego, your shadow, your heart, etc. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some extended learning programs. So what is the nature of our suffering? You've all heard some common sayings like, why me? Oh, why me? I don't deserve this. Or, by golly, I do deserve this. So what's up with this? Or how can I distract myself? I just can't deal. I want to have this just go away. So let me distract myself until it does with a pint of Ben and Jerry's or binge watching every show known to man over the weekend. Or things like, I'm not enough. I'm not enough of this. I don't have enough of that. So because I don't have enough, I'm just not going to bother. Or he's out to make me look bad. He's just trying to make me look bad. He's out to get me. Or what is she thinking? Oh my God, she is so clueless, inconsiderate, or superficial, or judgmental, or hypocritical. Or an idiot, name calling. We all see this all the time on social media. What an idiot. Or libtard, or whatever we want to talk about with different identities that people want to throw names at. Or glad I'm not like that person. That person is so awful. Or nothing ever works out for me. Gosh, everything always goes wrong. Can't seem to do anything right. I can't ever get ahead. Do any of those sound familiar to you? Either you've said them, or somebody else has said them, or you hear the other people saying them. So that is the nature of our suffering. We think life is a struggle. We think life is suffering. We have moments of happiness in the midst of suffering. And what happens is a lot of these sayings and these thoughts that are example from what I just gave you, they're emotions underlying them, they're feelings underlying them of anger, jealousy, envy, frustration, fear, impatience, resentment, sadness, and depression and guilt. All of these emotions, all of these feelings that are not positive, they're not constructive. And we're going to talk about how the fact that emotions themselves are neither positive or negative, but it's what do we do with them? How do we enact them or emote them or roll around in them or shove them under the rug that then becomes a destructive and therefore negative use of those emotions. And we're going to talk about these emotions, and let's just take a moment to define, what is an emotion? Well, if you think of emotion, it's energy in motion. And so emotions are designed to come in and go out. But when we get these emotions that we're using destructively and negatively that become increased anger, increased jealousy, it's about the level that it gets. That's when we're rolling around in them. And so how does all of this get started? Well, it gets started originally, we've heard all of the psychologists and psychiatrists that like to say, talk about the wounded child, everything goes back to your parents or your childhood and all of this kind of stuff. And the reality is it's kind of true. And not because it's all your parents' fault. It's nobody's fault, but our life experience started when we were a child, right? And as a result, we had experiences as a child, and not all of those experiences were warm and fuzzy. So we essentially had unmet expectations as a child where something happened or something didn't happen, and we kind of were jolted out of our joy, and we're like, well, that's uncomfortable. I don't like that. And then the ego, right? The ego lives up here in the mind and not in the frontal cortex. but in the mind, kind of back in here, and it's what you have with the motor mind, the brrr going on. I need to do this. I need to do that. Okay, well, what happened here? What happened here? Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? Who am I? Who are they? How does that act? You know, that kind of stuff. That's your ego. And what happens is when you have an uncomfortable experience, which of course started when you were young and you continue to have experiences through life, then the ego starts getting that motor mind going, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that say about me? What does that say about you? What does that say about life? And so all of these thoughts kind of go around and around and around. And then all of a sudden, some of these thoughts, especially if they're negative ones, they start engendering emotion. So then anger or sadness or depression or frustration starts coming along because these thoughts that we're thinking, that the ego is thinking, then come in, and then we start getting attached to these thoughts, and then that's what generates the emotions. And so now we've created a story. And what is that story? That story is who I am, who you are, who others are, how life is, and then that becomes our conditioning. And that then creates our life experiences, because then we see everything through these stories. We see them through who we think we are, who we think others are, how we think life is. And, you know, there's the saying, don't believe everything you think, because that's your ego telling you stories. And they are not true. They are based on lack in others, lack in yourself, lack in life. There's something wrong. There's something that's not enough. There's something that's not good enough. And fears. And as a result of the things of lack that we feel or believe that are occurring in ourselves and others in life, then we have fears around that. We don't want other people to see our lack. We don't want other people's lack to affect us. We have to get over lack in life. And so that's what creates then these conditioning. And because we continue to experience things and we have these stories, that is the cloud and the lens through which we see everything, then that becomes our life experience. And so you probably heard the saying, as within, so without, or as above, so below. Well, that's essentially what this means, because our egos are grabbing onto these stories with their underlying thoughts of fear and lack, and then the ego is driving and controlling our decisions, our behaviors, and our perpetuating thoughts around them. It's like we've stuck our brain in a box. You can envision your brain sitting in a box. That's exactly what we're doing. And then the more attention we give to our thoughts, we give life to them, and that's how they become our life experiences. And with repeated attention and repeated bringing up of those stories, they become belief. They become belief systems, and that creates habitual patterns. And so that's what ends up happening as we go through life. We continue to express our beliefs of lack and beliefs of fear, and then we create the patterns based on our egos driving our behaviors and our thoughts and all of that. And so as we continue to see life through these stories, it becomes a self-perpetuating prophecy. And it really mirrors back to us what's in our head. So what we are experiencing and what we are seeing in life is what we've got up in here. And so that's how your inner experience becomes your outer experience, as within, so without. And so what ends up happening is you've got thoughts, and then you've got emotions, and then you've got words, and then those all create beliefs. And then that becomes your actions, and that becomes your reality, and that becomes your results. So I've got this beautiful graphic that I'll have to send to everybody that has this circle of thoughts, then the circle of beliefs, and the circle of actions, and the words and the results. And that all kind of comes together to create your experience. So you will experience life as you believe it to be. And if that's a negative belief, it will produce a negative attitude and most likely a negative experience, because all of these beliefs and thoughts and emotions cloud and shape our attitudes. And then we actually become, our subconsciousness becomes part of our experience. And so I want to just take a moment to talk about words and the use of words. Our words reflect our stories. And if those are negative stories, then we're going to be using negative words. And the words have amazing impact. I don't know, many of you may notice or may know this study that was done on crystals by a Japanese doctor, Dr. Masaru Emoto. And what they did is they took water, put it in vials, containers, cups, whatever, and they taped words to the outside of the water. And they asked people to come by and say the word with the energy of that word to the water. And when they went through and had, however many people saying this word to the water, then they froze the water, and then they took samples of the ice, the crystals, and took it under microscope and seeing how the crystals formed. And so I'll have to send this to you guys because it's amazing. It's absolutely so gut-wrenching to see the impact that words have on water. And what are we, like 70–80% water? And so there had words like love and gratitude, which absolutely beautiful crystals. Wisdom, absolutely spectacular crystal, and they're different, right? Love and gratitude is different from wisdom. They had different crystals. Truth was beautiful. Thank you was beautiful. And then they had words like you disgust me. Couldn't even form a crystal. You fool. Couldn't even form a crystal. And that's what we're doing to ourselves. That's what we're doing to others. So even if we're only saying these words to ourselves, like, oh God, how could I have done that? I'm so stupid. Oh, I'm so ugly. I'm so fat. I'm so dumb. All of these things, they create this impact in our bodies. And it again is part of this self-perpetuating, and it just tears us down and tears us down and tears us down. And if you're doing it to other people, saying that to other people, then that's what it's doing to other people as well. So we will have to be very careful about the words we use because they really, really do have an impact. And so how do we create the shadow? So the shadow is actually created through these uncomfortable, unwanted feelings and thoughts about ourselves, about life. We just don't want to look at it, so we're like, I don't want to feel that, I don't want to think of that, I don't want any of that. So we shove it under what I call the unwelcome mat, and shove it all under that mat. Well, the problem with that is it doesn't go away. Just because we ignore it, it doesn't go away, right? It's like one of these long balloons that if you squeeze this side, what happens to this side? It goes boop. And so that doesn't go away. It just builds and builds and builds. And then it becomes part of our subconscious, and it just lurks back here, and it becomes what is the drive, the driver to our thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors and our triggers. Have you ever walked out of a situation and go, God, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I did that. Where did that come from? Well, that came from your shadow because it's lurking back here, and all of a sudden it's triggered by things that it relates to that it doesn't like. It's whatever you shoved under the rug gets triggered from the shadow. And we'll talk about projection in a minute, but that's essentially what the shadow is. These are unwanted, unaddressed, uncomfortable, and painful thoughts and feelings, and that we shove under the unwelcome mat, and we don't deal with them. And they don't disappear. They lurk. And they come out in times that we did not expect, and we're certainly not trying to. And so how do we know when we're dealing with the shadow? Well, that's when we think about words like woulda, coulda, shoulda. If only I would, if only they would, if only life would, if I should have done this, or I should have done that, they should have done this, or if only I could. And what that is the if only trio. It keeps us trapped and obsessed with past or the future. And so in the past, we're usually depressed, upset, angry, whatever that is that the past created for us, or we think it created for us, or it's the future. And it's angst, and it's stress, and it's fear. And so what it does is it stratifies us, the woulda, shoulda, couldas, in either past or future. We're either stressed in the future, or we're pissed off or sad about the past. And so we want to, and we're like a human on a wheel, on a hamster wheel, just going like this. We're in the past, we're in the future, we're in the past, we're in the future, we're in the past, we're in the future. And that's just an incredibly destructive place to be. And so our stories, because of all of the stories and all the emotions and everything that we tell ourselves, the lies that we tell ourselves, it not only creates the shadow, but it also creates personas and archetypes of who we think we are based on our thoughts of who others are and how life is. And so some of these archetypes, you know them, you've lived them, or you've seen other people live them. And a lot of these are going to trigger you. You're going to have a more visceral reaction to some than others. So the victim is one. And the victim is somebody who takes responsibility for nothing. Everything happens to them. They are box floating in the wind because everything happens to them. They participate in nothing, and they're just sitting here trying to live their life, and everything just well, that's a really sad place to be, because since that person doesn't take any responsibility for anything, they can't control anything, and so they don't do anything to change their experiences, and so it will continue to happen to them in their mind because they're not taking responsibility. So the know-it-all is actually trying to cover up for the fact that they feel lack in themselves. So they must then express themselves and show themselves as somebody who knows it all, because they're afraid that you might actually see their lack, or they just simply need that affirmation, that acknowledgement and recognition. The wallflower. The wallflower is opposite of the know-it-all. So we can actually say the wallflower is the suppressive version of the shadow, whereas the know-it-all is the aggressive form. The wallflower, because they feel lack, they just want to blend into the wall. Don't look at me, don't look at me, I don't want you to see my lack. And the dominator oppressor is one that is driven by fear. They must control, they must dominate, because they are afraid that they will miss out, or that others will dominate and control them. So they do it first. The judge, again, very much feeling of lack, and so they see lack in everybody else. Oh, you're bad, you're bad. They do it to themselves as well. Those of us who have the judge in them, we judge ourselves as much as we judge everybody else. And so that's where the words that we say to ourselves becomes really important. Because when we judge ourselves, we say a lot of negative things to ourselves as well. So the woe is me is different from the wallflower. The woe is me is, oh, nothing ever works out. Everything just always happens to me. So it's similar to the victim, but the victim can have an anger to them, where the woe is me is just droopy and sad. Now the passive aggressor, everybody knows what that is. The bully, again, is similar to the dominator oppressor. They are trying to hide their own lack of confidence, so they bully others. The whiner is different from the woe is me and the victim, which is nothing's ever good enough, so they have a little bit of the judge in them. Everything's bad, I don't whine, I want this, I want that, no, I don't want that, that's not good enough. Control freak trusts nobody, not themselves, not life. The best they can do is control everything because they have such a lack of trust. It's a very stressful place to be. The star and the show off, look at me, that's sort of, again, the opposite of the wallflower. And the gossip. The gossip has a lot of judge in them, and they feel a lot of lack about themselves, and so they judge others in order to hopefully make themselves look better or feel better because they're putting others down. So those are some common personas and archetypes that we can play in life based on the stories we tell ourselves, and we certainly see in others. And so what happens when we are actually in those personas and in these stories, we lose the ability to really choose who we can be, how we can behave, and how we show up, because our shadow makes us act and think pursuant to the stories and the persona it has created, and based on the conditioning. That is their conditioning based on the experiences. And so you become trapped by your stories. You become trapped from fear and frankly, addiction to our personas, addiction to our stories. So if you can imagine yourself in this little box. So not only we now put our brain in a box with our stories, now we put our whole body in a box with our personas and how we act and behave, because we have to be consistent. The ego is what's driving so much of our behaviors, and it wants to be consistent with its stories. And so with all of these thoughts of lack and fear that come from our stories and our conditioning that the ego then has created, the ego views life as one of limited resources, limited affection, limitation, and lack. And so as a result, it believes that we must compete because there is such a limit. And in that competition, therefore, we need to control, win, and dominate for access to those resources and affections. And so it creates this awful, stressful, competitive perspective about life. It's like you can see the carrot, like, you know, those dog races, which I don't support, but, you know, you've seen the visuals of them, and it's like this, the rabbit on a track that the dogs are chasing. It's like you take a carrot, and the carrot, and all the people are chasing it around the track. And that's how we live life so much of the time. And as a result of all of this, it creates polarized perspectives. Good, bad, right, wrong, us, them. There's nothing in the middle for the ego and its shadow, because everything, you're either on one side or you're on the other. And so whenever you are hearing yourself think about and say words like good, bad, right, wrong, us, them, you know you're in your shadow. That is a shadow ego perspective every time. And so as a result of this ego's belief and the shadow's belief that it is about limited resources, competition, need to control, win, and dominate, it believes then there must be separation. Separation from others is required. It's necessary because there's a limit. And so I must be separated from others in order to acquire the limited resources. And so it has a very, very destructive perspective of who we are and in not only ourselves and our stories in life, but how we are in relation to others. And so the ego uses tools, behavioral and emotional tools, to get its way. Judgment, criticism, anger, bullying, threats, withdrawal, withholding, insistence on zero-sum game, no compromise, and fear. Fear is a big one. And fear is what drives so much, either fear that something's going to happen or fear of missing out because of lack. And you know, and let's talk for a minute about what the ego's purpose is, because honestly, what the ego is trying to do in all of its misguided, destructive acts and perspectives is it's actually trying to protect you. It's trying to protect you from what it believes is the negative experiences that you started with in life, that you conditioned to have beliefs about as you've gone through life. And so it wants to protect you from that. So that's why a lot of times it shoves it under the rug, all those uncomfortable feelings and thoughts. Or it's also thinking it is trying to achieve for your interests, but it's really the ego's interests, and it's very misguided. And so we want to not view the ego as evil, because that's part of what creates the shadow. The shadow is everything that we shoved under this rug because we think it's bad, right? That's a polarized perspective, which is the ego's perspective. We think it's bad, or we think it's uncomfortable, or any of those things. And we want to embrace the ego, not roll around in it and, you know, get all into that cesspool of the ego and its shadow, but respect it in a way like a parent to a child. And, you know, misguided child, but a child. So we want to view it as a parent to a child, which is, okay, here's how we're going to deal with this. And thank you for your attempts to protect me, to help me get what I want, or what you want, what you think we need. And I say we. We'll talk about who we are and all of our different, you know, bodies essentially is what we have. But so we don't want to think of it as bad or negative, because that then increases the power and increases the size of our shadow. Think of it like a misguided child who thinks it's doing well, thinks it's doing the best thing for you. And so what ends up happening then when we go through life and we are in a community, we each have our shadow, and we each have our own stories and our own conditioning. Well, that creates a lot of conflict, because my story is different from your story, and my expectations are different from your expectations, which is different from hers and different from his. And so what ends up happening is these conflict, because I'm expecting something different than you're expecting. And if you've ever heard the saying, I'm sure you have, it's not perspective, it's reality. What is that called? I'll remember in a minute. Oh, for crying out loud. All right, well, I'll get to it in a second. So, but anyway, Because then when I interact with you and I have my stories and I'm in my shadow, I'm in my ego and my conditioning, and that triggers yours. Because if I'm out there with my expectations and my behaviors based on my expectations, and it triggers a negative thing on you, like, where do you come off? That's not how it goes. And so then you get into your shadow. And then we each are operating in our shadows. And then the more we're in our shadows, the more we go around being in our shadows, triggering everybody else in their shadows. And so we create a collective shadow. And that's really where we are today. We are in a collective shadow. And through all of our encounters and confrontations, we trigger each other's shadows to create a world of shadows, confronting each other every day. And that's what our world has become. So who are we? If we're not our ego, who are we? Well, I think everybody has an acknowledgement that we have a conscience, which is, this other part of us that kind of comes up and, when we're angry or when we're upset or when we're debating, how do we act, or, there's a conscious side of us that is trying to give us the path of the kind of the better path. And sometimes we listen to it and sometimes we don't. Well, some people, it doesn't matter what your spiritual beliefs are, because this really is a lesson for everybody, regardless of how you view a spiritual component to yourself, whether it's just a conscience, whether it's a higher self, whether it's your soul, whether it's your divine self, or just a consciousness, whatever it is you want to call it that makes you, fits within your current belief systems, is perfectly fine, because it's all essentially the same thing. And that's really who you are. So we talked earlier that the ego lives in the motor mind up here. Well, the higher self, the conscience, the divine self, whatever you want to call it, lives in our hearts. And so you have kind of your being, your consciousness has different places that it operates from. The ego is up here, and this is distinct from your brain. We're going to talk about your brain and your intellect in a moment, or your heart. But so you are not your outward identities or your ego identities. Who you are is irrelevant to your gender, your religion, your nationality, your ethnicity, because who you truly are as a conscience, as a higher self, has none of those identities. And that's who we truly are. And so really what we as our true self is an observer. It observes the ego. So the ego is the thinker of the thoughts. And again, I'm distinguishing this from the brain and the intellect, but the thinker of the thoughts, not the calculator. That's the brain and the intellect we'll talk about in a minute, but the thinker of the thoughts, the negative thoughts, the stories, the conditioning, all of those things. That's the ego who is thinking those thoughts. We are the observer of the thoughts. We are the consciousness. We are the one that's aware of those thoughts and emotions and the ego. And so let's now talk about the brain and the intellect. So the brain and the intellect is actually the calculator, right? It's the one that's calculating 2 times 2 is 4. It's the one calculating, okay, I have this situation, it's a problem, so now let me solve the problem in a non-judgmental, non-emotional way, and it just talks about and thinks about solution possibilities. The brain and the intellect is a tool. It's a very, very powerful tool. Our intellect and our brain is an amazing part of our human condition. And that is something that we have to protect and make sure who's using our brain. Who's using that powerful intellect and calculator and problem solver that we have in our brain? Is our ego, is our shadow using that? We don't want our shadow to be using this calculating, this brain and this intellect for tools of manipulation and control and things like that. We want our hearts and our truer self to be the one using our brain and our intellect for things and that are going to be in the highest interest of everybody, ourselves and others. And so the you, when I say the you is the higher self, the conscience, and you are the one that has the power to decide who uses that tool. Do you want to allow the ego and the shadow particularly to use it, or are you going to reserve that for the higher self and the heart? And so when you to look at the differences between the brain, the ego and the mind and the heart of the true self, the higher self, there's different values. So the ego, because it lives in fear and lack, its objectives are to, we talked about this: dominate, control, conquer, obtain. And therefore its values, because of its objectives, are superficial: power, beauty, intelligence. And intelligence is again using that intellect for its own purposes. I'm more intelligent than you, so therefore I deserve more, or I should get in the front of the line, or whatever it is, right? So other superficial values include status, things, and then of course control and dominance. And the ego is something that can never be satiated. It can never be satisfied. It never has enough, and because it lives on lack. Once it gets one thing, then it needs something else, and it wants something else, and it wants something else. So it can never be satisfied. And so I have some charts that I will send to you all about the differences between the perspectives, values, and tools of control, between the ego's values and goals versus the heart and the higher self's values and goals. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one of the ego's values and goals is power. The higher self heart's is growth. The ego likes pleasure. The higher self likes fun. And so the ego values progress, so it creates a world of competition, whereas the heart and the higher self values what all people bring, so it creates a world of equality, service, and cooperation. So the higher self values and views everybody as having a role. Everybody has a contributing role. I might be the right hand and you're the left foot. And neither of those is more important than the other. It is important. They're both important to the whole and to the purpose and the role of the collective. And so the ego will value mental stimulation, so it uses technology to feed addictions, fantasies, and objectifying and exploiting others. Right? We talked about who's using your intellect. Is your shadow and your ego using it, or is your heart and your truer self? And so the juxtaposition to that, the higher self in your heart values learning and growth, so it uses technology to share understandings, growth, information, and innovation. So I'll send you these charts so you have them, because then I also have some other charts here where it has different perspectives for the ego versus the higher self. So the ego sees life as a struggle, whereas the higher self sees life as an adventure. The ego will love life when and if ... something happens, right? Whereas the higher self loves life just as it is. The ego views challenges as frustrating obstacles and attempts to defeat them, whereas the higher self welcomes challenges for growth opportunities. And so you'll see some of these charts when you get this. So what is the impact of the shadow on our lives? Well, it's a saboteur. It sabotages everything. It sabotages us, prevents us from reaching our full potential, and it sabotages our relationships with others. It creates conflict with others, and it is destructive because it's domineering and it's controlling, and it plays mind games because it is based on illusory, conditioned stories. So I think the thing I was trying to remember is perception is reality. Well, that's your reality. So your perception is your reality. My perception is my reality. That doesn't mean that we have the same reality, because we have different perceptions, we have different stories, we have different conditioning. And so neither of those, quote, realities are in fact reality. But that's how we view our life, right? Because as within, so without. And so that becomes our experience. And so we have to remember that not everybody has the same reality, because not everybody has the same perspective. So that's where you have these conflicts of our conditioning. And so who we truly are, there's again, I have some more charts that are different perspectives of the ego versus the higher self. So like, for example, the ego's experience is suffering and wanting but not having. But the higher self is satisfied with what he or she has. Now, it doesn't mean it's complacency, because we're going to talk about how there are three positions that you can have with respect to a quality or an experience. One is balanced, one is imbalanced on the aggressive side, and one is imbalanced on the suppressive side or the passive side. And so being satisfied is a balanced state, but complacency is on the suppressive side. So we'll give you these charts so that you'll have them. Because now what I want to talk to you about is these qualities, like we just talked about complacency. So you have to be careful that the ego, and particularly the shadow, doesn't distort and try to talk you out of having a balanced place, because when you're in balance, the ego loses its power. The shadow particularly loses its power. So it will try to convince you that your balance is really on one side or the other, particularly on the suppressive side. So for example, kindness, it may try to convince you that your kindness is really putting you in victimhood, or your strength or your compassion is really rationalization or justification, or any of those kinds of things where it wants to push you into that. But yet, in reality, joy can be distorted to be either sad or phony. But courage, here's a really good one. Courage, when it's out of balance, it can be fear. But if it's out of balance on the aggressive side, it can be foolishness. Like you're going to jump off a 20-story building. Well, that's not courage. That's just foolish. And so every one of these qualities that is a quality that can be fitting of the higher self when it's in balance, but it can also be made out of balance on either the suppressive or the aggressive side. So you want to be careful and be really assessing what thoughts are running through your mind, because that's going to be the ego. And so when the shadow does show up, again, it has these two out of balance positions, the suppression or the aggression. So how does it look when it's aggressive? I think that's probably the easiest to recognize. It's extreme defensiveness, it's exaggerated attachment to an insistence on being right. You don't care about the thoughts and feelings of others. The only thing that matters is you being right. And you don't have a connection to, or you don't have an emotional relating to the other person. There's no compassion whatsoever. You accuse others, you're angry, you're frustrated, you blame, and you vent. So what does it look like when you're suppressing, when you're out of balance on the suppressive side? You shut down, you seek a distraction so you can disengage, you become depressed. And here's a very, very important one that I want to stress and talk a moment about: overvaluing being positive. So we talk about the polarized positions of good, bad, right, wrong, and that is always an ego position. Well, when you're overvaluing being positive, the reason you're overvaluing being positive is because you're viewing anything less than positive as bad or negative. That's an egoic perspective. You're in your ego, particularly your shadow, when you're doing that. Because emotions are neither good nor bad, it's how we use them that becomes either destructive or constructive. That when you are feeling an emotion that is uncomfortable, that you are viewing as potentially negative, but again, it's not negative, it's how you use it and how you deal with it that's positive or negative. If you're not addressing that anger or that sadness in a way that is, again, balanced position, right? If dealing with your emotions, the suppressive side is you ignore it and shove it under the rug, which just makes the shadow more and more powerful and bigger. And then, or you vent it in an aggressive way, that's out of balance as well. But the balanced position is neither of those. So you can't just ignore it. You actually have to deal with it. And dealing with it means not rolling around in it, but seeing it, acknowledging it, just like you do with the ego, where you don't view it as negative or bad, but say, okay, anger, sadness, I see you. And again, remember emotion, energy in motion. It's going to come in. Don't play games with it. Don't sit there and, roll around in it and dress it up and, play cards with it. You want to just let it roll on through, and maybe you get into your intellect and say, okay, let's analyze what made me angry, what made me sad, what are my triggers to this emotion, and then how can you let it flow positively. For example, anger. again, you can get angry at something, say it's somebody did something bad in the world, bad, right? That's an egoic perspective. Somebody did something that was destructive. They hurt somebody else. They killed people. They ran people over. We're seeing a lot of that in the world right now. It makes a lot of people sad, a lot of people angry. And so you can roll around in it and blame a certain segment of the population. Let's blame all this religion, blame all this ethnicity, blame all this country identity, blame all of this. It's your fault. You're bad. Well, that's not a constructive way of dealing with that. Instead, because that's rolling around in it and making it coffee. What we want to do instead is, okay, I'm going to let the angers move on through. And what I'm going to do in response to that is maybe I'm going to donate money. Maybe I'm going to go out and take on an action that I think is going to help and protect people or support victims or, whatever it is that is constructive use of that. That's how you have constructive use of anger or sadness or something like that. So you want to not overvalue being positive. You just want to be constructive with how you deal with your emotions. Some additional examples of suppressive out of balance with our shadow and emotions and how we react to them is a withdrawal and a complete lack of connection. We're losing connection to it all. We're shoving it under the rug, saying you're fine when you're not, instead being honest. That again is avoidance. And not saying sorry when we clearly hurt another. That's another form of avoidance. By saying sorry, we're having to acknowledge something we did that is uncomfortable, and we don't want to do that, so we just ignore it. And so what happens when we are suppressing? We are hiding and trying to stamp out what we believe is our darkness. And what we're really doing is we're stamping out a part of our own creativity and authentic power. Because again, as we were talking about that anger or that sadness that we're shoving under the rug, if we're shoving it under the rug, then we're not dealing with it. And we actually might have a creative solution or addition to helping the situation that if we're going to ignore it, we can't actually do, and we can't manifest that because we're shoving it under the rug. And so it's important that we don't shove that, because we may actually have something very valuable to add, that if we are able to deal with it, that will trigger or spur on some creativity that could help the situation when we're healthy and constructive with it. And another thing that when we suppress things is, I mentioned earlier that we are addicted to our personas. We are addicted to our shadows and our stories. Well, if you look at the addiction programs that are out there, the 12-step programs of all the whatever anonymous groups, one of the mainstays of that 12-step program, of all of them, is your secrets keep you sick. And so our shadow is created by secrets. Our shadow is created by us shoving things under the rug, closing it in the closet, and not dealing with it. And that is, in fact, what creates that shadow. That's what makes us and keeps us sick with our shadow. So just as addicts have to chemical substances, we have these addictions to our stories and our personas and to our egos. And so remember that when you are keeping a secret, when you are shoving things under the rug, that is what is keeping and making that shadow and keeping you sick. And so and then we become fearful that we can't manage or function or be successful without maintaining these stories and these secrets. And that is just, again, it's not true. We think, and if you've ever experienced something that you had a reticence to, or a fear about, or an anxiety about, once you actually deal with it, or you're forced to deal with it, you realize that, well, it wasn't half as bad as I thought it was going to be. You take this little molehill and you create this huge mountain. And that's what the shadow does. The shadow creates this huge thing that then is what drives all of this negativity, because it's huge, because we're not dealing with it. When we turn and face it, it shrinks down into size and it becomes something very manageable. So all of this denial and hiding builds and builds and builds. And it's sort of like an undisciplined child running around in a restaurant that is running around screaming and knocking things off the tables and bugging everybody else around them. Because trust me, our shadows bug everybody else too. and so again, we talk about the balance, and we talk about the suppressive and the aggressive out of balance positions. So how can we deal with that child? Well, we can do one of three kind of places, right? The suppressive would be to ignore it, let that child run around screaming and just say, oh, well, that's how children are. That's just the way it is. Well, that's just how children are at 3 years old. Or we can be on the aggressive side of out of balance, grab that child with aggression, throw that child in a chair, shake your finger at it and yell at him. And then what happens to that? Well, the child then cries even more, right? So that's exactly what happens to our shadow. It's exactly the same thing. So the balanced thing would be to go get that child calmly, lovingly, say, I know you're restless, I know you're tired, I know you're bored, but here, let's sit down here because we can't go and run around like this. Let me get you a coloring book, crayons. You know, maybe you were proactive and you brought some toys with you to that restaurant for that child. That's how we have to do with our egos and our shadows, is knowing what our triggers are, being prepared. How are we going to deal with this when we get triggered? You know, meditation, other tools that we'll talk about. And so that's a constructive thing. And that's how we deal with that in a constructive way. And our shadows and our egos is the same thing. So one of the things that we talked about in the shadow is, you know, our triggers, right? So we want to be prepared and we want to identify what our triggers are. Well, how do we identify our triggers? Well, because I mentioned earlier that the shadow that is back here in our subconscious has hidden away, or you've hidden it away, because of an uncomfortable feeling and an uncomfortable experience that you don't really want to acknowledge. A lot of times they are uncomfortable feelings about ourselves, or uncomfortable things that we've done that we don't want to admit to ourselves, or that other people have done that maybe says negative things we think to us about who we are, so we just hide it because we don't want to deal with it. Well, what ends up happening is that trigger, that shadow back there, it recognizes that experience when, or that quality when it sees it outside of itself. And so it becomes a projection. So it sees something and then it automatically projects onto it what its issue is. So for example, hypocritical, right? You can have, see somebody that's hypocritical and accuse them and be very aggressive. Oh my God, I can't believe you're hypocritical. That is so hypocritical. Well, what's actually probably happening is you actually have hypocritical tendencies yourself that you've shoved away in that closet underneath that unwelcome mat, and it is coming out. As within, so without. Your hypocritical experience or tendencies is actually getting projected onto other people, and you're blaming them for what is really your issue. And I'll give you a perfect example. A friend of mine was driving to meet a group of us, and she got there and she was talking about an experience that we've all had, that somebody on the highway kind of got into her lane and cut her off. And you know, most of us, you know, there are various reactions we've seen to this. One is full-on road rage, but her response was none of that. It wasn't any, you know, suppressive or aggressive. It was a, wow, I'm so glad I didn't run into the back end of them. And that just practically slapped me across the face, because I thought, wow, I never would have thought of that response. And I'm here thinking, okay, how would I have responded to that? How have I in the past responded to that? And you know, you think, well, who is this person? Who do they think they are? Just ripping right into my lane, my lane. And who do they think they are? How, you know, they think they just rule the roost here and have all the roads to themselves. How entitled is that? Well, here I am thinking, my lane, who's coming into my lane? Like, I have ownership here. And I'm thinking, who's got the entitlement problem here? That person in the car, or is that me? Because there's not a difference between the person who cut off her and the person who cut off me. The difference is me versus her. And so you have to see that in yourselves Whenever you have a visceral or dramatic response, an over-the-top response to a situation, to somebody else's characteristic or quality or anything else, that is a sign that it is your shadow. Because there are different ways that you can react, right? You can have this visceral, oh my God, are you kidding me? That is ridiculous. You are so hypocritical. You are so judgmental. That's a visceral, over-the-top, dramatic response. That is your shadow. Thou doth protest too much. That is projection. That's your shadow. Because you can also have just simply an observer, right? Your true self, your heart, is an observer. It is the one that's experiencing all of this. And so it has the ability to just simply notice. I think that was kind of a hypocritical thing to say. That's an observer status versus the visceral. And so when you have that visceral reaction, that is your shadow. Thou doth protest too much. Take a look at that mirror, saying, okay, I've really reacted negatively to that. That's a quality. That's something that I just viscerally respond to. I better look at myself on that one. Because that's where you see a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of resentment, a lot of hatred, a lot of over-the-top, high-intensity emotion. That's projection. That's your shadow. And we see this everywhere. Everybody's operating in their shadow. And we've got to, help ourselves stop that. You guys have seen the little balls that have the, ball that hits here and then it shoots out here. And so it goes like this, and like this, and like this, and like this. Well, what happens if you were to kind of not allow it to go up so high and you stick your hand in and it kind of comes in? Well, then it has a less response on this side, and then it has a less response on this side, and then it has a less response on this side. And so you end up calming it down. So as we are going through and encountering others, we have the choice, we have the ability to either continue that pattern and that reaction, or we have the opportunity to dial it down and keep it a little bit more into a balance, or try to get it into a balance. So in addition to seeing negative sides of others, here's a nice thing about projection. You may also see a nice quality in somebody else that you admire. That person's courageous, that person's generous. Well, there is a saying by a woman who has since passed away, but has been an expert in this field of the shadow, Debbie Ford. She used to say, you spot it, you got it. Well, that has just as true for positives. So if you see somebody and you really admire them, courageous, generous, you spot it, you got it. But because of our egos and our shadow stories of who we are, what we're good at, what we're not good at, how life is, we prevent ourselves and others from showing up who they really are. So if we feel like we have this admiration for somebody else's qualities, then we have to, and we don't think we have them, well, you spot it, you got it. So we have to look at what is our story that we're telling ourselves that says that I can't show up that way. And you could have somebody who, whether it's the wallflower, whether it's the whatever persona that, you feel like you are, maybe it's you don't think that you have anything, positive to say or intelligent to say, or you're not a good public speaker, or whatever you have, somebody else is going to know more. And as a result of that, those silly, illusory stories that we're telling ourselves, you may actually have something beautifully important and profound to communicate to the world, but because you're telling yourself all these negative stories, you don't actually express that. And the rest of the world is losing out on who you really are and the messages that you have, because you're not allowing yourself to show up as that person. So what are some other signs of the shadow? Well, we keep making the same mistake over and over and over again. We keep picking the same type of partner. We're always being late. We're procrastinating. Last-minute drama, food binging, or we hear ourselves say the same things every time we're upset. And if somebody says to you, you always say that, or you always react this way, you got to take a look at that and say, okay, well, let me see what my triggers are here. Or you emotionally regress to a younger child when you're reacting, like when we're around our families. And this is so perfect because when we're around our families, we find ourselves reacting the way we used to react. And we're thinking, God, that's just not who I am anymore. Well, that's part of your conditioning, and your conditioning was created as part of that family. And so that is your shadow that continually kind of comes up when you have those triggers with family. So why do we care about addressing the shadow? Well, the shadow, as we've been talking about, will come out, whether we want it to or not. It becomes triggers for our annoyances, fears, feelings of lack that we see in ourselves and others. It shapes the way we feel about ourselves. It shapes the way we feel about life and others. And it becomes the way we view the world. And the more negative things we haven't dealt with constructively, it becomes the source of self-sabotage. Doing that which you most don't want to do, or being that which you most don't want to be. And we lose a part of ourselves. We get buried into that closet that's trying to help us. And we want to look at it objectively. We want to gain its valuable messages and use it for energy, for constructive growth, and for constructive action. And when we address the shadow, it will allow us to be our best selves, the person we were born to be, without being driven by negative experiences and conditioning from the ego and the shadow. And it allows those who we've judged or condemned, for frankly, a lot of times having qualities that are actually in our own shadows, to show up as they truly are. And for us to see them without the cloud of our own shadows and triggering their shadows. It improves our relationships with those around us. And how someone behaves is their responsibility and their karma. But how we respond to it or react to it is ours. So you cannot blame somebody else and saying, well, if that person would be nicer, if that person would be this, if that person didn't do that, sorry, it doesn't work. Your reaction, your behavior is always your responsibility. Always, 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 always. If you're trying to blame somebody else, that's your shadow. And when we're no longer acting out of our shadow, we're less likely to trigger other shadow. And instead of becoming a collective shadow that we have in the world right now, we become a collective higher self. How beautiful would that be? We all want to help each other. We all see the compassion, and we have compassion for each other. We all see the higher self, the beauty in others, the role and benefit and value of others. When you change your belief, you change your lens, and therefore you change your experiences of life. And as the saying goes, 10% of life is what happens to you and 90% is how you respond to it. Well, changing our relationship to our thoughts and our emotions is what changes our lives. And we not only are we changing ourselves, but we're changing the world. Ripple effects are powerful, 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 powerful. We were just talking about how when you're not operating in your shadow, you can change the way other people react. And we all want to be the change, right? We all want to be the change you see in the world. As Deepak Chopra says, changing the world is an inside job. So one of the things that I would like to remind you about this is because we're putting ourselves in a box with our shadow, we must make friends with it so it doesn't control and define us. And we want to stop seeing things as inside the box or outside the box, right? That's the imbalance on either side. If you remember seeing the Matrix movie with Neo, the hero of the movie, he was the first Matrix. He was in the waiting room with all these gifted kids waiting to see the Oracle. And there was a child who was bending the spoon with his mind. He was just going, shh, like it was just liquid. And so Neo says, I want to try that. So he takes the spoon and he's focusing and trying hard to bend the spoon, and it just dips, hardly moves. And the child says, in order to bend the spoon, you must realize there is no spoon. So guys, there is no box. There is no box. So we want to step out completely, get not even out of the box, we want to explode the box. We want to rip it to shreds and take back our own power and know that all of these stories and all of these boxes that our ego has put us in are illusions. Those are self-imposed. And if you have the aspiration to be something, it's because you have the qualities to manifest it. But it will be manifested in your own way. So you don't want to compare yourself to others because you have your own unique blazing path that you have the opportunity when we want to be our best human. That's the gift of the shadow, is the opportunity to be our best human. So see the shadow as a gift of lesson. Like it's a difference in perspective that we talked earlier about between the ego and the shadow's perspective of life, of bad and struggle, versus the higher self and our heart's perspective, which is opportunity for growth and learning. The more you learn from your shadow, the higher you grow, the higher you progress, the more you grow, the better person you become. Because life, frankly, is like a river flow. You cannot fight the flow. But how you go down that river, you can control. And it's about what is your relationship to your thoughts and emotions about your experiences. Have you built yourself a sturdy kayak with a sturdy oar that you can maneuver yourself around boulders and flow through those dips in the rapids? Because sometimes you're in, the nice, calm, soft pools, which is beautiful. But sometimes you're in those crazy rapids. And you want to build yourself and have for yourself that sturdy kayak with that sturdy oar. And you don't want to be one of these boxes floating in the wind, getting tossed around in the rapids all over the place. And so the effect of transmuting the shadow, seeing it, dealing with it, getting into our higher self, the heart, to run our lives, our perspective shifts from the ego to the connectedness to others. And if your spiritual beliefs believe in the divine, it certainly helps in that as well. And so your perspective changes from all of those stories to actually seeing not through the rose-colored glasses or the gray-colored glasses, but what's really happening. You become happier, and you gain access to the qualities and attitudes that love life, which is who your higher self and your true self is. You gain access to the qualities and attitudes that enable you to cope with the challenges of life, because they are inevitable. They are inevitable, and they're designed to give you lessons for growth. And so how you deal with them is going to be determining how your experiences in life and how long you have to experience those growth periods and those challenges, because it gives you the power to choose what perspective to have and how to see life, whether it's a place of fear and lack or a place of joy and opportunity, and not be in manipulation and fear and control. So identifying the ego shadow. So we're going to talk about in a full curriculum. I have an 8-week curriculum or an 8-session curriculum, however often we decide to do these. Right now they're designed to be once every week. We can always do them once every month. We're going to look more into identifying the ego shadow. When are we in our shadows? How are we reacting versus responding? What is our relationship to our stories? What is our relationship to our emotions? And how to have a different relationship and transmute the nature of that relationship. Understanding the shadow, what is it saying to us? Looking out for the words "I mean my mine," and not allowing that tail to wag the dog. How to identify it and immediately make a change. And then transmuting that shadow for good, integrating it back into us for constructive wholeness, identifying those feelings and emotions, and feelings versus emotions. Emotions, energy, and motion, those are different from feelings. And we're being able to recognize that what should be flowing in and out versus what is a feeling that is telling us whether we're aligned or not with our higher self. And over time, you'll be able to sense and recognize this more on your true self. And over time, you'll be able to live more in your true self on the surface instead of buried underneath the egoic self, and controlling and mastering our own emotions. And it's not about control in terms of a control freak, but in terms of choosing. We choose how we respond. We choose whether we allow that emotion to come in and flow out and to be in motion, or whether we want to choose to sit down and have tea with it. And we want to be empowered to make that choice and know that we are not a victim of or sitting in the passenger seat to our emotion driving the car. So do you want to be motivated by fear and lack, or by joy? That's what transmuting the shadow would do for you. So I have a couple of quotes, a couple from Stephen Hawking, who passed away recently, I'm sure as all of you know. And black holes ain't as black as they are painted. They are not the eternal prisons they were once thought. Things can get out of a black hole both on the outside and possibly even to another universe. So if you feel you are in a black hole, don't give up. There is a way out. It is probably not your fault, but it is no good blaming the world or expecting it to take pity on you. One has to have a positive attitude and must make the best of the situation that one finds oneself in. So something I want to leave you with to think about is here at Liberate from Hate, we do not enable victims. We empower masters and heroes. And that's what we want to do with this course. So we hope that you will join us for the full 8-week session. A little bit more detail about what's in the full curriculum, more in-depth coverage of key emotions and behaviors, and to how to transcend your thought stream, transmute the shadow, and changing your relationship to emotions that and drives that can be used in a destructive way, like fear and judgment and control and anger and hatred and patience, shame, guilt, depression, discouragement. We're going to dive deep into those emotions, and you're going to be doing some work on your own. We'll do workshop type activities so that you can identify these for yourselves. And then ways you can respond to others when they're in their shadows instead of allowing them to trigger yours. And you can de-escalate theirs as well. Projection details, how it works, how to identify it and stop this behavior so that you can see it for what it is, your own shadow that's interacting with another's. And getting and staying in the observer state to detach from the destructive emotions, stories, and attitudes of the egoic mind. And again, this is in a balanced position. It's not like ignoring detach, it's arm's length, where I see you, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to deal with you, but I'm not going to roll around in you. And stopping the thought stream's destructive impact of the past and the future, the woulda, shoulda, couldas. Staying in the present and out of that obsessiveness of either the past or the future. And a more in-depth on identifying the triggers to our shadows and transmuting the impact that the shadow could have, changing our stories, and again, relating to our thoughts and emotions differently, dealing with the challenges in life with better coping skills without triggering the shadow, and more in-depth of who you are, attaining and retaining that higher consciousness, that love, that happiness and peace, and the ripple effects to others. And again, this happiness and joy is not about complacency or burying your head into the sand. It's about the serenity prayer, the courage to change the things I can, the contentment to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so there's no constructive use in getting all angst and wrapped up into things we can't change or things that are just going to bother us. We can see them, we can let them flow in and flow out, but we don't have to wrap ourselves around in them and focus on the negativity. There's so much joy, there's so much positive in life. We want to focus on that while being as constructive as possible on the negative. So thank you so much for joining. I hope that you got a lot out of this, and I hope to see you in our full 8-week program. You can find out about it on our website at liberatefromhate.com. And then depending upon how you're watching this video, you may actually have a link to the course itself. So we definitely don't want to have price and cost be a barrier to entry, so we're offering it at ridiculously low costs. So we hope to see you there, and if you want to do a staged integral payment plan, we'll also allow that as well. So just email us at administrator@liberatefromhate.com. And you can also, of course, email me directly, dawn.ely, E-L-Y, @liberatefromhate.com. And thank you for joining me, and hope that you all liberating from hate and are starting to identify your ego and your shadow. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you next time. Thank you.